We're going to read from John, chapter 11, verses 41 through 44. I cut it way down. And I won't read all of this story, but I will reference it. So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." May God add blessing to the reading of these words. During the beginning of the pandemic, 3 years ago, this month, right? I remember social media postings day after day of people asking, why is God allowing this to happen? It's that question, why? Some people posted, if God is an almighty sovereign God who loves humankind, then why the virus? And honestly, the responses to this post, like it's part of his plan, or he wants you to trust him, they seem to leave me feeling a little bit empty. Honestly, I was struck by why so many people responded with why questions. It made me think about our expectations of God and why we even expect God to do something when tragedy impacts our life. Why do we? I don't pretend to know the answer to why, but paying attention to Jesus shows us that with God, there is always more than our expectations. So we'll dig into this story of Lazarus, but first I want to tell you about some friends who were hanging out one day, and the conversation grimly turned to the issue of death. So one of the friends asked another, "What would you like people to say about you at your funeral?" One friend answered, "I want people to say that I was a great humanitarian, one who cared about their community." Another replied, "I want people to say that I was a great parent and partner, an example for many to follow." A third friend, after giving it some thought, answered, "I would hope someone says, 'Look, he's moving.'" I know we haven't had a joke in a while, so I thought I'd share one. Death doesn't have to be so gloomy. Well, there are lots of family and friends who had gathered at Martha and Mary's house to grieve with them over the loss of their brother Lazarus. The custom of the day was that the mourners would stay for a week to weep and to wail and to comfort the sisters over their loss. Martha and Mary had sent for Jesus. Both of them knew that he could heal their brother. But Jesus did not go right away, and so Lazarus died. You see, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus and Jesus, they were good, close friends. He had spent many times in their house. And we are told that as Jesus approached the village of Bethany, Martha runs out to meet him. Now, this is the Martha who, at the dinner party that they once threw for Jesus, was so upset with her sister because Mary just kept sitting at the feet of Jesus and wasn't helping her do any of the work. At that dinner, Martha had taken Jesus aside and tried to get him to straighten Mary out. But Jesus told her, Martha, only one thing is needful. Mary is choosing the better portion." And now, Martha is on the lookout for Jesus. She had sent for him, and she knows he's coming. She now understands the one needful thing. And when she sees Jesus, she makes a beeline straight for him. In my mind's eye, I see Martha running up to Jesus and embracing him and crying into his shoulder, "If only you had been here, my brother would not have died." She is struck with grief, but she remembers who Jesus is, and as she weeps there in his shoulder, she adds, "But I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Now, Martha really isn't asking Jesus to bring Lazarus back to life. She is stating that she believes. She's just acknowledging, "I know who you are." God would not have let Lazarus die if Jesus had been there and had asked God to spare his life. She believed that. Jesus comforts Martha by telling her that her brother will rise again. Martha agrees with Jesus. She believes he will rise on the resurrection day, that last day. It seems to be a hope that she's clinging to, but still, she is full of sadness. Then Jesus presses Martha to acknowledge a little more. He says to her, the very famous passage, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do we all believe this? Believing in the resurrected Christ is the foundation of our faith. And it is here that Jesus tells Martha he is the resurrected Christ, even before he has died. The disciples, along with friends and followers of Jesus, they had a hard time understanding what Jesus was telling them. They lived with Jesus, and as they got to know him, certain expectations began to form. And so Martha answers, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Then Martha runs back home to tell Mary that Jesus is calling for her. And Mary, she runs and she falls at the feet of Jesus. Two sisters with the same heartfelt cry. Mary says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It is interesting that both Martha and Mary are sure that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. They had seen him perform many miracles. He had stayed in their home, and they were very close to Jesus, but yet both of them said, "Lord, if you had been here." It seems as if they speak from a disappointment in an expectation. Lord, if. They believed that Jesus could have saved his good friend, this brother, a loyal follower. Jesus, if you had been here. Now, I realize there are many passages in this chapter 11 of John, and if we focus our attention only on the power of God that is revealed when Lazarus walks out of the tomb, then I believe we are missing a profound insight, a vision that both Jesus and the author of this gospel are trying to explain. That is to say, when we have certain expectations of God, we limit God's ability to work in our lives. In verse 37, the crowd, they ask, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man had kept this man from dying?" They had all come to know what to expect, what Jesus was capable of doing. They had seen it with their own eyes, and they knew of God's power. But in their minds, that power was limited. That power did not go beyond death. This bothered Jesus. It states, he was greatly disturbed. Jesus was also grieving the death of his friend, and he was sad to see that his friends were hurting. and he wept with them. But the people could only talk about disappointment and questioned why. Why? So Jesus goes to the tomb, and he tells the people to take away the stone. And once again, Martha cannot understand and protest about the smell. But Jesus presses Martha again. He says to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" This crowd only knew of life and death. So yes, Martha experiences the glory of God as Lazarus walks out of the tomb. But the point for these friends who are gathered to support these sisters is that God is more than we know, more than we can imagine or even comprehend. In his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer writes, "What comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us." What comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Tozer argues that our view of God, what we believe God is like in the deep recesses of our being, that it shapes the whole course of our lives. So let's think about that for a minute. What comes to your mind as you think about God? What is it that you think? What are those words? Think about choices and decisions that you make about money, about your neighbors, your family, about this church, and yes, how you respond to tragedies. What do you think about God? Have you made those choices because of what you believe deep down about God? It only leads to the question of how does the power of God work in your life or in this world? The question of those who wonder why Jesus did not come to Lazarus sooner, that is often the very question that stops many people from believing in Christ. Maybe it is not possible to provide a logical answer for this crowd that is standing at the tomb. They are asking, if God can do this, then why doesn't God do that? But God's activity in the rising up of Lazarus is not dependent on this crowd believing in the glory of God. God's power comes from your love and your prayer. That's what Jesus shows us at this tomb. That's what Jesus does. He speaks about the love. Jesus witnesses the grief that everyone is having. He's feeling it. He's deeply moved. He weeps with his friends. He loves them. And then Jesus prays with thanksgiving and confidence, believing that God hears him, and he's doing it because he wants others to know it. He wants them to know it too, that he is praying to God and he believes it. God's glory is revealed because Jesus' love for others and his relationship with God. That's what's revealed here. It is through this powerful event that Jesus conveys his vision of God's glory. That vision, that God's power in our lives is love. God's power is love. It is not resurrecting someone from the tomb. God's power in this world is love. How do you vision God's glory? Are you one of the family friends that's standing in the crowd around the tomb? Are you wondering why Jesus didn't show up sooner? Or maybe you think, oh, Jesus or God let Lazarus die on purpose. It was part of the plan to show off his power. But if that is true, then I have to ask, why did Jesus cry? Why did he pray? Why do we need to read about all those details? Why doesn't Jesus just stand there and command Lazarus to come out? And of course, I have another question. If God brings this dead man back to life, then surely God could have made the burial clothes fall off of him. At least off his face. I think we've seen the pictures of people talking about Lazarus coming out of the tomb and he can't even see. But Jesus, he asked the people to help, to unbind him and let him go. Jesus did not do everything that was needed to be done for Lazarus to live. Unbind him and let him go. The same type of thing happens in Ezekiel 37. That's the Hebrew text for this week. It's the story of the dry bones in the valley of dry bones with Ezekiel. When the bones come back to life, God asked the prophet, can these bones live? Ezekiel responds, Lord, you know, you're God. But God, he doesn't command the bones to live in that story. He doesn't command them to grow muscle and skin and fill them with breath. God uses Ezekiel to prophesize the possibility of new life. In both stories, God needs us to act. God needs us to believe in possibilities. God needs us to love. God needs us to love instead of allowing our expectations to limit God's power in our lives. Because God is always more than we can expect. Amen.